Hello and welcome. I'm Rawia Alami and this is the Dailies, where we take a look at important news stories, reports, analyses and articles published in newspapers and media outlets across the world. Different news stories dominated the focus of newspapers today. The war on Gaza, the humanitarian catastrophe unfolding there amid negotiations as well as preparations for the major Israeli ground offensive in Gaza City received a lot of attention. While local news dominated American newspapers, from President Trump's tightening his grip on Washington, D.C., to what has been called his war on American institutions. We'll start with The Guardian, which, with Plus 972 magazine and Local Call, published an investigation shedding light on startling data from a classified Israeli military database. The report reveals that as of May 2025, only 8,900 Hamas and Islamic Jihad fighters were confirmed or presumed killed, while Gaza's health ministry reported over 53,000 total deaths. This indicates that about 83% of those killed were civilians, an unusually high ratio compared with most modern conflicts. The report also included a chart, as you can see, showing estimated civilian death rate in global conflicts. And as it is depicted in the chart, in global conflicts tracked by UCDP since 1989, civilians made up a greater proportion of the dead only in 3 cases. In Srebrenica, and also, although not the Bosnian War overall, also in Rwanda genocide and during the Russian siege of Mariupol in 2022. The report contrasts these findings with Israel's public claims of far higher militant casualties, suggesting that official figures have been inflated for political purposes. Testimonies from soldiers and also analysts reinforce the picture of indiscriminate targeting and a military strategy that disregards civilian protection. Scholars warn that the patterns resemble conflicts defined by population displacement and even genocide. With Gaza's devastation ongoing, the report concludes that the war's human toll remains overwhelmingly borne by civilians. In its analysis, the Jerusalem Post examines Israel's dilemma over whether to accept a partial ceasefire hostage deal with Hamas or pursue full military action in Gaza. Following Hamas's reported acceptance of an Egyptian-mediated proposal, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has demanded the release of all remaining hostages, also signaling plans to occupy Gaza City, heightening internal and international pressures. The analysis highlights the split among hostage families, also political factions, and also the global observers, emphasizing the human and strategic stakes. Gaza City, with its tunnel network and Hamas command infrastructure, is central to both negotiation leverage and potential military risk. The piece underscores that Israel's decision will shape the war's trajectory, weighing hostage safety, military objectives, and long-term security against Hamas's entrenched resistance and also use of hostages as bargaining tools. In an exclusive, the Wall Street Journal reveals growing divisions inside the Federal Reserve ahead of its September policy meeting. At the Jackson Hole Symposium, Cleveland Fed President Beth Hammack opposed cutting rates, stressing that inflation remains too high and rising and that the labor market is stable enough to avoid easing. Now, by contrast, Boston Fed President Susan Collins signaled openness to a cut, citing risks of weakening employment and strains of higher tariffs on consumers. The report also highlights a debate reflecting broader uncertainty within the Federal Reserve as officials weigh President inflation, or persistent inflation rather, against slowing job growth. With investors' expectations shifting after mixed data, the piece underscores how September's decision could indeed reveal deeper rifts over the balance between fighting inflation and supporting growth. The New York Times published a report providing an in-depth look at President Trump's recent show of force in Washington, D.C., examining hundreds of images and videos to track law enforcement activity. The article highlights the deployment of over 800 National Guard troops, with nearly 2,000 expected, primarily stationed at high-traffic areas like the National Mall and Union Station. Also, federal agents from 8 agencies, including the FBI, ICE, and the Secret Service, have patrolled the city, set up checkpoints, and conducted arrests for minor infractions and immigration violations. While Trump frames the operation as a crime crackdown, reporting shows most arrests were for immigration issues, and guardsmen played a support role rather than enforcing the law. The report paints a detailed picture of the administration's militarized presence in the capital and its implications for civil enforcement. Foreign policy tried to explain why the Donbas area remains central to the war in Ukraine. The explainer shows how Donbas, an industrial and mining hub along the Russian border, has both symbolic and strategic value for Vladimir Putin, who claims historical ties to the region. Yet the piece details the long history of conflict from 2024 Russian-backed separatist movement to the full-scale invasion in 2022, highlighting the human and territorial costs. The explainer also underscores Ukraine's determination to hold key fortress cities despite heavy Russian occupation. By combining historical context, military analysis, and also perspective of both sides, the piece offers a concise and also informative overview of the stakes in Donbas. Emma Ashford wrote in the Financial Times, arguing that the U.S. must embrace a more realistic approach to foreign policy amid growing global uncertainty. She critiques decades of American strategies aimed at reshaping the world, from Clinton's engagement and enlargement to Bush's freedom agenda, arguing they overextended U.S. power and also risked conflict. Instead, Ashford advocates a realist framework focused on security, strategic alliances, and also a manageable balance of power, prioritizing achievable goals over grand ambitions. She notes also that some form of military involvement is inevitable, but stresses that this should be paired with a proactive trade agenda to maintain America's economic leverage. The author views the Trump administration's steps as partly pragmatic, but inconsistent. Overall, the article calls for a balanced U.S. policy that reduces global overreach while strengthening economic influence, representing realism as a path to sustainable power and prosperity. The Washington Post reported today on Florida's Alligator Alcatraz detention center, highlighting the clash between immigration policy and the environment. Remember, a few months back, the state of Florida announced the building of a temporary detention center set up in the Everglades of Florida, surrounded by swampland and alligator habitats. Of course, using trailers, tents, chain link fencing, and generators, all to hold migrants awaiting deportation. While recently a federal judge has ordered the state to shut down the facility within 60 days. Of course, after finding it, harms the Everglades and threatens endangered species like Florida panthers and wood storks. Now, also, the report explains how the center was built quickly on an old airstrip to hold up to 5,000 immigrants. The piece clearly shows the tension between the state's push for strict immigration enforcement and urgent need to protect fragile ecosystems. And we'll end with a Telegraph, where Cara Kennedy wrote, warning of a growing literacy crisis in Britain and beyond, calling it a civilizational catastrophe. Drawing on research from the UK and the US, she highlights a sharp decline in reading for pleasure, especially among children and teenagers, as screens and social media dominate daily life. Kennedy argues that this loss threatens critical thinking, imagination, and democratic engagement, noting that adults too are increasingly functionally illiterate. She critiques also attempts to gamify learning and tech industry's role in fostering distraction while shielding its own children from screens. The article paints a stark picture of a society sprinting toward idiocracy, where culture, politics, and history are reduced to bite-sized digital snippets, eroding the foundations of thoughtful citizenship. That's it for today. Thanks for watching.